Human beings are physically incapable of tolerating their own unmedicated consciousness. We simply cannot endure an unstimulated mind. Our entire civilization is not a pursuit of progress. It is a desperate biological flight, a synchronized escape from the physiological terror of silence. The human brain perceives an empty room as a lethal threat. We build cities and screens to forcibly drug our own nervous systems. Watch a 28-year-old commuter on a train. Their smartphone battery dies. The glass screen goes completely black. Within exactly 45 seconds, the physical deterioration begins. Their gaze darts rapidly, floor to window, window to floor. The fingers of their right hand start a rhythmic tremor against their thigh. They subconsciously clench their jaw. They swallow heavily to clear a tightening throat. They reach into a coat pocket. They check it 3 consecutive times. They know it is completely empty. The central nervous system ignores this logic. Their breathing shifts instantly. Deep diaphragmatic expansion stops. It is replaced by shallow, rapid upper chest respirations. This is not boredom. This is the onset of clinical panic. But here is the brutal physical reality. Sitting alone in a safe, quiet room is objectively harmless. There is no physical predator. There is no external danger. So what catastrophic internal threat is the body physically attempting to escape? What exact biological mechanism is triggered inside the skull when the silence drops? 400 years ago, Blaise Pascal diagnosed the human condition. He stated all human misery stems from one physical failure: the absolute inability to sit quietly in a room alone. We manufacture relentless auditory noise. We construct complex, high-stakes societal games. We do this solely to avoid confronting our own physiological nullity. Watch what happens when external sensory input is severed. The human brain does not gently power down. It automatically triggers a localized neural circuit. This is the default mode network. Evolution engineered this circuitry for primitive survival. Its sole function is to endlessly scan the environment for hidden predators. It is strictly programmed to simulate worst-case future scenarios. When a modern human sits in a silent room, the network loses its external data feed. The radar has no physical targets to lock onto, so it immediately turns its gaze inward. The unanchored network rapidly devolves into aggressive rumination. The prefrontal cortex is hijacked by this ancient survival software. It begins to violently loop through minor past social failures. Then it escalates to the ultimate, unsolvable threat: the absolute certainty of your own biological death. The actual fatal mechanism is purely chemical. The default mode network projects these existential simulations. Deep within the temporal lobe, the amygdala activates. The amygdala is a blind, primitive alarm system. It physically cannot distinguish between a charging predator and a conceptual thought of mortality. It perceives the silence as an immediate, lethal attack. It sends a high-priority electrical signal straight to the adrenal glands. The glands instantly dump a steady, low-grade stream of cortisol into the bloodstream. This toxic hormone floods your major organ systems. Your vascular system physically constricts. The resulting somatic state is not philosophical sadness. It is a literal, severe biochemical panic. Watch close how they react. An individual lies flat on a mattress at 11:30 p.m. The room is plunged into total darkness. They stare directly upward at an invisible ceiling. Their resting heart rate begins to accelerate. It climbs steadily from 65 beats per minute to 85. Capillaries dilate. A localized flush of heat develops rapidly across the back of their neck. The central nervous system demands an immediate intervention to dissipate the adrenaline. To shatter the neurological loop, they execute a violent physical reset. They abruptly roll their torso over. Their hand shoots out to grab a glass rectangle. They expose their dilated retinas to intense, concentrated blue light. The thumb begins rapidly swiping upward. They inject a relentless feed of disconnected, hyper-kinetic imagery directly into the optic nerve. They do not stop until ocular fatigue forces their eye movements to become sluggish. The chronic avoidance of baseline somatic distress destroys the hardware. the brain learns it cannot survive silence without an external sensory anesthetic. This constant chemical flooding induces severe dopamine receptor downregulation. The neural pathways are systematically scorched. The individual is rendered physically incapable of sustaining long-term attention. They lose all biological capacity to generate intrinsic motivation. We successfully weaponize external reality. We use screens and noise to drug our own nervous system into submission. But here is the brutal physical reality. What happens when the external distractions fail? What occurs when the physical body itself mutates into the source of inescapable terror? Blaise Pascal suffered from severe chronic illness his entire life. This disease systematically stripped away standard societal diversions. He was locked in a localized confrontation with human fragility. The actual fatal mechanism is embedded in the enteric-brain axis. The human gut and the brainstem are permanently fused together. They are wired directly through the thick cable of the vagus nerve. Pascal suffered from chronic, unrelenting digestive disorders. His compromised intestinal tract misfired continuously. It sent an uninterrupted stream of nociceptive pain signals upward. These electrical impulses slammed directly into his brainstem. This created a perpetual state of sympathetic nervous system arousal. The body is forced into a permanent fight or flight biological baseline. The brain can no longer sustain the psychological illusion of physical permanence. The hardware is actively screaming that it is dying, and it gets worse. Healthy human brains possess a localized neurobiological shield. This is the optimism bias. It is physically mediated by the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. This specific neural cluster actively suppresses the probability of negative future events. It chemically blinds you to the reality of your own biological death. It does this solely to encourage daily motor functioning and calorie gathering. But unrelenting physical pain acts as a continuous localized trauma. This chronic pain signal actively suppresses the anterior cingulate cortex. The electrical activity in this vital region physically dims. The brain loses its structural ability to filter out objective reality. It is forced to process the real-time data of its own impending decay. Watch close how they react. A person suffering from chronic neuropathic abdominal pain attends a celebratory dinner party. The room is saturated with high-volume auditory input. The people around them engage in rapid, aggressive conversational turn-taking. But this person's gaze remains absolutely locked. Their eyes are fixed exclusively on the microscopic grain of the wooden table. They display involuntary micro-contractions of the facial musculature directly around the orbital bone. They consciously tighten their transverse abdominal core muscles. They manually override their autonomic nervous system. They force slow, measured inhalations purely through the nasal cavity. They are physically bracing their skeleton against a surging wave of somatic nausea. They have completely severed all neurological engagement from the social reality occurring 2 feet away. This triggers a total psychological alienation from the human collective. Societal status instantly loses all structural meaning. Accumulated wealth ceases to trigger any neurochemical reward. Future planning completely loses its dopaminergic value. The reward circuitry refuses to process external stimuli. The individual is neurologically stranded. They are trapped inside a localized, inescapable reality of cellular deterioration. The body becomes a hyper-dense prison of pain signals. But here is the brutal physical reality. External distractions eventually fail. The physical body eventually breaks down and provides no refuge. The human brain is pushed to the absolute brink of neurotoxic overload. This threshold event forces a radical, involuntary biological failsafe. At age 31, Blaise Pascal experienced a violent psychological rupture. History calls it his night of fire. It was not a philosophical revelation. It was a catastrophic neurological event, an overwhelming, visceral burst of absolute certainty. It completely bypassed his linguistic capacity. It instantly overwrote his logical processing centers. The actual fatal mechanism is a biological circuit breaker. Under extreme, prolonged cognitive load, the brain is bathed in lethal levels of stress hormones. The physical hardware cannot sustain this chemical toxicity. To prevent cellular death, the brain executes a forced localized shutdown. It drastically downregulates electrical activity in the prefrontal cortex. This is the neurological seat of logic, time perception, and the human ego. Clinicians call this transient hypofrontality. The structural boundary of the self dissolves completely. The biological capacity to perceive time linearly simply vanishes. The brain forcibly deletes the illusion of the individual to save the organism. And it gets worse. Simultaneously, the temporal lobes undergo a radical physical mutation. These specific regions govern emotional valence and spatial processing. They suddenly experience highly synchronized, localized electrical discharges. It is a microscopic biological storm. This discharge floods the entire brain with massive doses of endogenous opioids. It triggers an instantaneous, concentrated dump of dopamine. This chemical flooding creates an overwhelming, non-verbal sensation of absolute unity. The brain physically hallucinates the concept of infinite peace and divine truth. It is not a spiritual miracle. It is an extreme, involuntary survival mechanism, a brutal neurological reset switch for a system on the verge of fatal collapse. Watch close how they react. A person experiencing a spontaneous, stress-induced dissociative episode stands alone in their kitchen. They abruptly drop to their knees. Bone impacts the hard linoleum floor. Their tear ducts instantly overproduce saline fluid. The liquid streaks down their face in heavy volumes. Yet, their facial musculature remains completely slack. The microscopic muscles around the eyes display zero signs of distress. Their vocal cords autonomously emit a low sustained hum. Their respiratory rate drops drastically to exactly 6 breaths per minute. The ambient room temperature is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Their physical body completely stops shivering. The aftermath of this event is structurally permanent. The brain's delicate reward circuitry is irreversibly rewired. The dopaminergic pathways are permanently recalibrated. The central nervous system deletes its original biological programming. It no longer attaches ultimate survival value to physical calories. It ceases to trigger reward responses for societal status or reproduction. The fundamental survival instinct is forcibly grafted onto an invisible, transcendent conceptual framework. The organism is now physically anchored to a permanent hallucination. But here is the brutal physical reality. You do not need a divine neurological short circuit to survive the void. Humanity did not wait for spontaneous brain trauma to cope with silence. Evolution engineered a far more insidious, secular mechanism to force us to keep moving forward. Blaise Pascal proposed a famous gamble. He stated that betting on a divine creator was the absolute only logical choice for survival. But in a modern, secular reality, the brain executes a different biological wager. It forcefully bets that earthly human existence itself holds intrinsic, undeniable value. Evolutionary psychology reveals a fatal flaw in human cognition. We possess the advanced neurological capacity to calculate our own inevitable expiration. This realization of certain death generates paralyzing physiological terror. If left unchecked, this terror physically halts daily foraging and reproduction. To prevent biological stalling, the brain aggressively constructs a defense mechanism. It hallucinates intricate cultural and personal meaning systems. Belief in the value of your daily actions is not a philosophical choice. It is a mandatory psychological buffer against mortality salience. The brain builds a firewall of artificial purpose to block the paralyzing truth. The actual fatal mechanism is rooted deeply in the mesolimbic pathway. This primal neural circuit does not require objective, cosmic truth to function. It operates strictly on the biochemical anticipation of a reward. By actively forcing a belief that life is meaningful, the brain executes the secular wager. This forced belief directly stimulates dopamine production deep within the basal ganglia. This specific chemical release physically initiates motor function. We wager on meaning for one brutal, mechanical reason. Without that wager, the central nervous system refuses to command the physical body to move. You do not choose your purpose. Your neurochemistry extorts you into creating it. Watch close how they react. A corporate employee sets a digital alarm for exactly 5 a.m. They are training for a regional marathon. Mathematically, they possess a 0% chance of winning this race. The alarm sounds in total darkness. The sudden auditory blast triggers a brief, localized spike in cortisol. They physically lace up synthetic running shoes in the cold. Their prefrontal cortex briefly generates an objective, logical thought. Running 10 miles today alters absolutely nothing about their eventual biological death. The brain immediately and violently suppresses this fatal realization. Instead, they look down to check a smartwatch metric. This manufactured, entirely arbitrary goal triggers a localized, 3-second surge of dopamine. This microscopic chemical hit physically propels their skeleton out the front door. They step into the freezing morning air, entirely fueled by a localized, neurochemical lie. And it gets worse. Humanity operates as a massive, self-sustaining delusion engine. We do not build careers and families out of pure, untethered joy. We are biologically extorted into endlessly creating arbitrary goals. We construct massive societal systems to harvest microscopic drops of dopamine. We relentlessly hunt for meaning simply to prevent collective physical catatonia. But here is the brutal physical reality. We are driven right to the absolute edge of the abyss. We stare directly into the biological void of our own extinction, only to realize the engine pushing us away from the ledge is built entirely from our own inescapable biology. Meaning is not a magical cosmic gift. It is not a romantic philosophical pursuit waiting to be discovered. It is a brutal, compulsory biological excretion. Your nervous system physically secretes purpose to survive. You do not find meaning, your neurochemistry forcefully extorts you into creating it. Without this forced hallucination, you face immediate psychological paralysis. We are nothing but hyper-advanced meat machines. We are biologically terrified of our own expiration date. We force ourselves to hallucinate grand purposes. We do this simply to justify the caloric expenditure of waking up. Blaise Pascal was absolutely right about the clinical horror of existence. But he was fundamentally wrong about the cure. The cure is not a divine creator. The cure is the brain's relentless, unyielding capacity to lie to itself. Stop analyzing your existential dread. Do not treat your boredom as a philosophical failure of your character. Treat it strictly as a physiological baseline. It is merely the somatic reality of a hyperactive default mode network. When you feel the terror of silence creeping in, stop thinking. Do not try to outthink a compromised neurological system. Your prefrontal cortex is already structurally hijacked. You must force a blunt, physical hardware reset. Fill a bowl with ice water. Plunge your face directly into the freezing liquid. Hold it there for exactly 30 seconds. This thermal shock instantly triggers the mammalian dive reflex. It bypasses your cognition and forces your central nervous system to drastically drop your heart rate. The chemical panic loop is physically severed. Immediately after, force your skeleton into a high-friction, complex physical task. You must physically silence the biological hardware. The psychological software will have no choice but to follow. If you still require comforting illusions to navigate your existence, subscribe. We are just getting started.